بكم مرة أخرى. أنا سأتحدث أو سأنتقل للإنجليزية لأن الشباب والباحثين المقيم معي يعني هذه لغتهم. So I'm going to switch to English now. I am very pleased to head this session that we're going to speak about mainly transformations that happened in Europe. We have three main cases. First with Gordon Clubb, who is going to talk to us about the case of the IRA, of the Irish Republican Army. And then Nick Hutcheon, who is going to talk to us about the ETA organization in the Basque Country / Spain. And then last but not least, Murat Yeşiltaş, who is going to talk to us about the Kurdistan's Workers' Party, the PKK. So without any further ado, I'm going to go ahead with that. First, Gordon is a lecturer in international security at the University of Leeds in the UK, whose research focuses on de-radicalization and social movement. And he also has, I'm very much interested in his work because he talked a lot about how former fighters affect current armed movements and the interaction between that. Also the interaction between the mid-ranks and the grassroots. And I'm going to give him the stage now to speak about the IRA case. Thank you.
Second, sorry. Is it different? Why is this not working? Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. So I've been asked to talk about the transition from the provisional IRA from arms to peace. I've been asked to firstly discuss whether we can conceptualize it as a draw or a defeat. So just to give a bit of background, because many of you probably know that there are many IRAs. The Provisional IRA are one of the more dominant groups of the time period. The Provisional IRA's campaign emerged in December 1969 in the context of the Civil Rights Campaign in Northern Ireland, the Civil Rights Campaign for nationalist Catholics, which through protests and the response of the Northern Irish government led to the conditions that the Provisional IRA emerged in. The troubles, so when I'm referring to the IRA, I'm referring just specifically to the provisionals. So the period I'm looking at is the disengagement period, so where the Provisional IRA announced the ceasefire in 1994, and this culminates in the Good Friday Agreement in 1998. After decommissioning, we've been talking about the arms and the giving up of weapons. After decommissioning, the Provisional IRA announced their formal standing down in 2005. So what I want to do is to look at that period, what factors led to this disengagement, this move away from violence. So first of all, does the draw or defeat help us understand transformation? The draw and defeat, for me, links back to two different conceptual approaches to negotiations and how militant groups' campaigns end. Now, as has been mentioned before, groups by Omar, many groups rarely win. They rarely win, and they rarely achieve their strategic objectives. However, I think that understanding the IRA in terms of defeat is not very helpful in the sense that many groups don't actually engage in violent behaviour for strategic purposes. It's much broader than that. And obviously with Brexit, who knows, perhaps the Provisional IRA will achieve the goals of a united Ireland, so we can't necessarily reduce it to draw and defeat. In terms of the draw, what we often mean here is a stalemate. Has there been a stalemate in a conflict? And the idea here is by William Zartman's theory that when you have a ripe situation, you'll have a transition to a peace. However, this ripeness or stalemate does not explain the provisional IRA either. The same conditions from during the peace process, the same conditions had been present for 20 years. The content of the peace process in 1998 was by and large similar to previous peace process proposals in the 1970s and onwards. So we cannot look to the conditions of the time, we can't look at repression, we can't look at the peace process content to explain why the IRA moved away from violence. We need to look at something more. And this is why I think we need to look at interplay. Now, interplay refers to the interaction within the movement. Now, I just want to be clear, I'm not ignoring other factors. For example, the European Union has been very important in the provisional IRAs, the peace process, where we have external factors like Bill Clinton and the US leadership playing a role in the peace process. However, for me, interplay is the last piece in the jigsaw that leads the IRA from an armed group to a group that disbands and engages in politics. Significantly, it leads to the majority of the movement disengaging as well. Now, from the 1990s, when I'm talking about interplay, the 1980s, you see within prisons, members discussing the peace process, discussing the use of violence. From 1990s onwards, we start to see a change where members are engaging in much dialogue about the utility of violence. So this is what I'm meaning by interplay, is this, as mentioned, the interaction between the grassroots, the mid-level leadership and the higher ranking leadership in discussing the strategy and the way forward. And I think here in this quote that I put here, is a quote from a provisional IRA member from Belfast. And what she argues is that the split, avoiding a split within the movement, was incredibly important for the provisional IRA. Now, they didn't want for the movement to break up significantly. And the fact that they weren't willing to move forward in a peace process if it damaged the movement too much shows the importance of interplay. It shows the importance of dialogue, that you need this interaction within the movement to agree, to be ready for negotiations, and why that is so important. And in this quote, she says, "We wanted the debate to take place in the room, so it wasn't going to take place in the street." Because the one thing, probably the most important thing for us, what we have learnt from our history, was that once we lost our unity, then it's all over. Now, this is not to deny that there were splits within the movement. There were splits within the provisional IRA and the Republican movement. But the fact was these splits had occurred in stages was also important, that members left in stages within the real Sinn Féin and then a real IRA as well, and then continuity IRA. So by breaking up in small parts, it reduced the opposition to Gerry Adams in the leadership. So that was an important factor. But nevertheless, the IRA managed to bring along most of its members, and that is important, obviously, because if most of your membership leave, then the peace process risks in terms of stability. So when I'm talking about interplay, I'm not just talking about dialogue. I'm not talking about people just sitting around a campfire or sitting in a barn and chatting. There's something more to it than that, I think. And there's the reasons why that dialogue is successful. And it can be, there's a few factors here identified. Once again, there are probably many more, but I think these are the most important ones. So why was this dialogue, why was this interplay important for the IRA? First of all, you saw in the 1970s a change in the organisational structure of the IRA. It had moved from a mass movement mobilisation structure, hierarchical, lots of membership, high recruitment rates, to a leaner movement. So they changed the structure, which meant that what I would call generational hegemony was established. A specific type of part of the movement, the northern leadership, primarily who joined in the 1960s, became the most important members of the movement. Recruitment started to narrow and slow down, so the movement grew older and organisation grew older. Why is that important? Because it gave the leadership control. It gave them greater control over the movement. So the structural changes we saw in the IRA in the 1970s was very important. Secondly, prisons. Now, when we think of prisons as a site for radicalisation. Prisons are presented as something problematic. However, what we see in Northern Ireland is prisons were important for the peace process. The prison system, which was relatively unique. The prisons in Northern Ireland were divided into wings where the political movements, so the IRA, the other more Marxist organisations and loyalist paramilitaries had their own wings. They had control of their own wings, and and the political leadership was replicated there. So you had people within the prisons who were responsible for maintaining the movement. Now, why was this important? That when in the prisons, you started to see the engagement in more ideological work. So prisoners started they weren't ideological to start with. They began to become more interested in ideological workings. And it was these discussions that within the prisons led them to reconsider the use of violence. However, it wasn't just some friendly chat once again within the prisons. It was managed dialogue. That the changes within the provisional IRA structure meant that Gerry Adams had greater control over the prison system and the IRA prison system, the membership system within it. So you had greater control. So this allowed the dialogue to be pushed in a direction that was to the leadership's liking. And this is once again a structural factor here. It is about organisational control, but by also maintaining the perception of a legitimate dialogue. And once this dialogue had taken place in the prison, it moved outwards into the movement. And we've got to understand why within prisons did this dialogue, this questioning of violence occur. Because on the outside, when you're on the run from the military, it's difficult to question the military strategy. Therefore, prisoners had that luxury of being able to discuss this. By being politically active within the prison system, the prisoners were able to become more articulate, more educated, and once they were released and engaging with the movement, they were able to convince the rest of the movement to follow the strategy. So the prison system created credible voices at the grassroots, which managed to disseminate throughout the movement. But also, another important factor here is how disengagement is sold, how it's framed. So when a movement engages in violence, it has to justify the use of violence. The same occurs when the movement moves away from violence, but we don't often look at it in those terms. So what we see is the provisional IRA justifying and telling a story of why it should move away from violence. And this story resonates because of this generational hegemony. So to be able to convince members of moving away from violence, you have to maintain narrative fidelity. You have to not entirely abandon your roots ideologically in terms of membership commitment. So you need to build a story which maintains some consistency. And the provisional IRA were able to do this by linking back to the 1960s struggle. So instead of emphasising getting Brits out and the military strategy, they re-emphasised the importance of the civil rights movement and the importance of equality. So they brought these ideas back. And that was able to convince members to move away from violence because they also were born in that period. And this is why generational hegemony is important. If you had younger people engaging in the movement much more, then it would have been more challenging for the IRA to convince those with that type of story. So what that means today in the provisional IRA narrative is when they talk about violence, they're saying violence today is bad, but violence previously when we did it is good. So they don't say violence, they don't delegitimize violence completely. They split it in terms of post-peace peace process and during the peace process. So before and after the peace process. So they split it into two parts, one which is illegitimate, one which is legitimate. Now, that is very convincing for IRA members because then you're able to say that the IRA members, we did the right thing, now we're doing the right thing by giving up our arms. That was the way it was convincing for IRA members. The problem with that narrative is when they try to tell younger people that, because younger people weren't born in that experience. So they see it as glamorizing violence. Therefore, what we see now is this narrative of disengagement evolving to de-glamorize violence in the past. So we see the way these stories are told to be important. Why am I mentioning this? Because de-radicalization is not occurring in this situation. I remember asking a member of Sinn Féin about I mentioned the word de-radicalization, and they says, we're not de-radicalized, we are radicalized. So radical and being radical is important to actually maintain your legitimacy and convince members to move away from violence. So we shouldn't seek to de-radicalize movements to get disengagement from violence. In fact, in this case, it was radicalization, I would argue, that helped move away from violence. And that is contrary to much of the counter-terrorism literature or policies. Once you have the acceptance of the peace process, it's a case of what do you do with them. It's about reintegrating these former combatants. And of course, we talk about them politically. We know Martin McGuinness, we know Gerry Adams. They were integrated into the political system. However, it's also important that you reintegrate your grassroots members. They're not going to want to go into politics, so you need to find an alternative route for these former combatants. And Northern Ireland, for me, is a special case because it was former combatants who were an important role in preventing violence at the community level. It was the Provisional IRA members who were working hand in hand with the police to prevent violence that could destabilise the peace process. Because we talked about in some earlier talks about organisational structure, Provisional IRA did officially abandon its structure, officially. Unofficially, the Provisional IRA maintains its structure as an informal veterans network. That is important because it was through this informal network the Provisional IRA, as former combatants, are able to mobilise resources to prevent violence. So when we're looking at prevention of violence in transition, it's not necessarily that abandoning an organisation or structure is important for peace. Maintaining an organisational structure can also be important for peace, where those former combatants are playing a crucial role in preventing violence in community areas, especially where the police have no control. One example I was given by a Provisional IRA member, the police, during the peace process, the police called him, a member of the IRA, and he came up and the policeman sent the IRA men in to stop violence. Now, I think that's fascinating. You see the RUC at the time working with the IRA on an informal basis. And this is why, once again, we see the role of community. And it's not to do with de-radicalisation in this size. Being radical maintains your legitimacy. And these are some of the things I think we should consider when we're discussing transitions from violence to peace. Thank you very much. And thank you for the translators for translating my Scottish accent.
Thank you very much for that excellent presentation, Gordon. Basically what you said is you almost destroyed a significant percentage of the counterterrorism and security literature on the need to radicalize as opposed to but I need to ask you, what do you mean by that at some point? Like, what do you mean by radicalize? Because I understood it maybe upgrade the narrative or the ideology, but the behavior you need to derad. You can't do it in that way when you're getting into parliamentary politics and so on. So we can talk about that in the Q&A period. And also I'll ask you about the comparison with Fatah, because I know that we have some former Fatah commanders here, and they would be quite interested in knowing your opinion in terms of the comparisons. So now I will move on a bit south to the case of ETA with Nick Hutcheon, who is going to talk to us about the transformation of ETA after defeats. Although we can discuss the defeat situation during the lecture. So all yours, Nick. Thank you.
Sorry? Okay, well, I hope the translators or the interpreters like Scottish accents, because here's another one. I just have one slide. I've just put this up just because it's handy to show the territorial context of the Basque Country. The Basque Country is a stateless nation, it would be the best description of it, which is contained within the French and Spanish states. So within the Spanish state, as you can see here, you have two autonomous communities, and then within the French state there are three provinces which are part of a French department of Pyrénées-Atlantiques. I'll be speaking obviously now about ETA. ETA, the acronym ETA stands for Euskadi eta Askatasuna, and that means Basque Country and Freedom. And ETA's founding goal, the reason ETA came into existence, was to struggle for the independence of the Basque Country and for that Basque state, once established, to be a socialist one. So, earlier this year, this is a fresh case, earlier this year in May, ETA announced its dissolution. After not achieving its goals of Basque independence or creating an independent Basque socialist state. However, the circumstances in which ETA ceased to exist are very different to the ones in which it came into being. So ETA came into existence in 1959, and when ETA was formed, the Spanish state was a dictatorship led by General Francisco Franco, and under Franco, all signs of Basque national identity were censored. The use of the language, any symbols such as flags, pretty much anything that was related to the Basque Country and Basque identity was prohibited. At the same time, the most populous Basque provinces, you can see them there, Biscaya and Gipuzkoa, were both labelled by Franco as traitorous provinces. The reason he labelled them as being traitorous was because they were both predominantly red and Basque nationalists, and the use of the Spanish word, the rojos separatistas, was something that Franco was not keen on. And because of that, both of these provinces were singled out for particularly harsh treatment during the years of the dictatorship. But now, in 2018, the Spanish state is a democracy, albeit an imperfect one at times. The Basque Country has a substantial degree of political autonomy. The Basque language is flourishing, and Basque nationalism is now the dominant political force in the Basque autonomous community. From a Basque nationalist perspective, you could say that socially, culturally, politically, the Basque Country is a better place than it was when ETA was formed in 1959. That has been the case for some time, and so as the years have passed, increasingly amongst the Basque nationalist community, the idea of the armed struggle has become more anachronistic and eventually come to be seen by many as even counterproductive. And so finally this year, the leadership of ETA confirmed that position, and ETA's dissolution was announced. Something that struck me as someone who kind of follows the ETA and the Basque Country very closely for many years was that the end of ETA, the announcement of the dissolution this year, was kind of surprisingly low-key. There wasn't a lot of fanfare surrounding the announcement. There weren't many pictures of politicians shaking hands and posing for cameras, no militants emerging from prison gates, no flag-waving children or anything. Instead, the announcement of ETA's dissolution, which was the end of the longest-running armed struggle in Europe, was really surprisingly low-key. And the sense that this was is a kind of transformative moment in the history of the Basque Country was kind of subdued. This is not being pessimistic, far from it. There's no reason for being pessimistic here. It's just an observation about the way it's happened, and it's to do with the particular context in which this takes place. And there are many reasons, and we could talk a long time about it, but all I'll do just now is just set out 5 things that kind of come to my mind about this context that we're in at the moment in the Basque Country. First of all, in terms of this being a kind of low-key, subdued transformation, is that the Spanish state denies that there is a conflict between ETA and the Spanish state. It doesn't recognize the existence of a conflict. The ending of ETA has been long and kind of drawn out. There's been a protracted ending. Number 3, the end of ETA has, in terms of immediate consequences, quite limited immediate social and political consequences. Fourthly, there have been very negligible signs of dissent within ETA and within the wider Basque nationalist left movement to which ETA belongs. And fifthly, there is a kind of, you could say there's a relative ease for disengaging ETA militants, because of the existing social and political structures of the Basque nationalist left which currently exist. So firstly, the Spanish state doesn't recognize its relationship with ETA as a conflict. It doesn't do that because it doesn't want to confer political legitimacy on what it defines as a criminal organization, pure and simple. The intransigence of the Spanish state in this matter is rooted in the premise that its role is to uphold the law. That is not only with respect to ETA's use of violence, but also its main objective, that being Basque independence. Secession from the Spanish state is actually illegal, and it's enshrined in Article 2 of the Spanish Constitution, which was drawn up post-Franco. In the Spanish Constitution, in Article 2, it states that the Spanish nation is indivisible. That is in Article 2. Therefore, the Spanish state doesn't recognize itself as multi- or plurinational, and nor does it recognize the Basque Country, Catalonia, or Galicia as nations with the right to self-determination. Seeking to secede from the Spanish state is anti-constitutional and as such illegal, which effectively criminalizes the aims of sub-state nationalists such as those in Catalonia and the Basque Country. In Catalonia over the past year, the imprisonment of high-profile political figures, and this is in the news today as well, who were involved in staging the referendum in 2017 on charges including treason and sedition, has shown how severely the Spanish state is willing to uphold Article 2. So as far as the Spanish state is concerned, politically, with or without violence, there is no conflict, there is the Constitution, there is the law, and the role of the state is to abide by both without compromise. In that context, seeing no conflict, the Spanish state has rarely engaged with ETA. It has at various times, but recently it has not engaged with ETA. So it has rarely engaged with ETA to encourage the organisation to end the armed struggle, but also it has done almost nothing to find a way for Basque nationalism to achieve its main goal, Basque independence, democratically. In recent times, under the government of the right-wing PP, the Partido Popular, has mostly ignored the peacemaking efforts of figures within the Basque nationalist left. And what's more, it's actually shunned and ridiculed initiatives involving external actors. So the Spanish state has made a very great effort to extinguish any portrayal of the relationship between it and ETA as a conflict. But in the end, this might actually, although unintentionally, have suited both sides. On the one hand, ETA can claim to have made a unilateral decision to bring an end to the armed struggle without being seen to have conceded to demands made by the Spanish state or to have been defeated, and on the other, the Spanish state can claim that its counter-terrorism measures have been vindicated without being seen to have conceded to demands made by ETA. But effectively, the denial of the conflict on the part of the Spanish state has meant that the passing of ETA has produced competing and conflicting narratives on the reasons and consequences, meaning there is no unified sense of achievement, nor is there a unified project for the post-ETA era. So ETA's dissolution, point 2 here, ETA's dissolution about the protracted ending. ETA's dissolution was not a sudden development. In fact, the announcement that the organisation was dissolving itself was the latest in a series of announcements drawn out over a period of 8 years. So the most important of these came in 2011, when ETA called a definitive ceasefire. This came after 2 previous announcements, which less convincingly announced the organisation's commitment to ending its armed activities permanently. Having broken previous ceasefires, there was understandable scepticism from the Spanish state about the sincerity of those announcements. But because of that, despite the direction ETA was very obviously moving in, the Spanish state and the Spanish media continued to insist that there was nothing ETA could say that would interest them unless it was to announce and verify its dissolution, which it has now done. The reporting of ETA's developments from 2010 in the Spanish media is quite interesting as well. The hostility of the conservative Madrid-based media didn't decrease, as the end of ETA became more tangible and obvious. It actually seemed to increase, to the extent that the dissolution was even reported as something like bad news. In any case, by the time ETA announced its dissolution, 8 years had passed since the first announcement, indicating the organisation's intention to end all armed activities and eventually disarm and dissolve. ETA's armed activities slowed down considerably in the 21st century, and it became obvious that the organisation had neither a clear military strategy nor the military capacity to carry out one. Also, in terms of the intellectual influence of ETA, and its political influence, that has been in decline also for a considerable amount of time, possibly even dating back as far as the 1970s. At that time, ETA was the vanguard of Basque nationalism in terms of its ideas and action, but that has declined since then considerably. Once the dictatorship had ended and the Basque provinces had political autonomy, ETA's role became primarily a strategic one, focused on forcing the Spanish state into meaningful negotiations or creating a Basque nationalist alliance. These objectives have both proved unattainable, so the end of ETA has been a long, drawn-out process of intellectual and military decline, accompanied by diminishing popular support and increasing awareness within the Basque nationalist left of the armed struggle as an obstacle to progress. The end of ETA had been on the cards for a long time before now, or even 2011, so actually when it finally came, it was really no surprise. In terms of point 3, with immediately, there are no significant social or political changes. Nothing changes significantly immediately as a result of ETA's dissolution. It's interesting and a relief to be in what can now be considered the post-ETA era, but day-to-day life for the vast majority of people, except former militants and the police and the security forces, remains the same, and the stalemate between the Basque nationalist left and the Spanish state is unlikely to be broken, as the situation in Catalonia has shown. In social terms, the Basque Country is not as divided as many academics, politicians and political commentators convey. Some have compared the Basque Country to Northern Ireland, but this is really misleading. The Basque Country is an area which is characterised by the effects of very large-scale intrastate immigration, the coexistence of multiple identities, and the normalisation of bilingualism. ETA members reflect Basque society. Many were not born in the Basque Country, many are the offspring of intrastate immigrants from other parts of the Spanish state, and many don't speak the Basque language. Bilbao is not similar to Belfast, so there are no walls dividing one community from another. It's a melting pot of identities and languages, as is the whole of the Basque Country. So it's not a typical post-conflict society that requires the type of cross-community peace building seen in other markedly divided societies such as Northern Ireland. In political terms, ETA's armed struggle has ended, but its goals have not been achieved, and the campaign for a socialist Basque state continues. So that remains a problem to be solved for the Spanish state, and we need to look no further than Catalonia at the moment to see what the Spanish state's the Spanish state's tactics against ETA and anyone judged to be associated with ETA were also aimed at its political aims as well as its means of achieving them. Within the last 20 years, the political parties in the Basque Country have been banned, youth groups illegalised, bars closed, newspapers shut down, and expressions of opinion judged to be pro-ETA have been criminalised under the offence of glorifying terrorism. This has been called by some people the everything is ETA approach, and it's resulted in the imprisonment of hundreds of activists of the Basque nationalist left. There is no political will, with or without ETA, to find compromises with the Basque nationalist left, and therefore there has been no amnesty, no transferal of Basque nationalist prisoners to Basque prisons, no talks, no handshakes, no Basque version of the Good Friday Agreement. So, in terms of finding a democratic solution to the Basque problem, at the moment it's as you were, and there's no change in that at the moment. Fourth, in terms of signs of dissent within the Basque nationalist left, that has been negligible. From 2005 to 2011, the Basque nationalist left discussed and eventually agreed upon a strategy for the future that didn't involve ETA. This process was led by Arnaldo Otegi, an ETA militant in his youth, who has been the political figurehead of the Basque nationalist left since he became leader in 1997. Throughout this process, the Spanish state had refused to negotiate, but an agreement had been reached by the members and the grassroots of the Basque nationalist left that this was the way forward. Otegi's jailing in 2009 due to accusations of being under the orders of ETA brought international attention to the situation, and an international delegation came to the Basque Country which included Kofi Annan, Bertie Ahern, Jerry Adams and Jonathan Powell, and these people came to produced a declaration of Ayeti in which they urged all sides of the conflict to come together and find a peaceful way forward. 3 days later, ETA announced its definitive ceasefire in 2011. That was the fruit of Otegi's work and the fruit of long debate and negotiation within the Basque nationalist left. And since then, we've seen no signs of significant dissent within the Basque nationalist left, and no signs at the moment of a situation similar to Ireland, in which something that's called like a real ETA or a continuity ETA could exist. At the moment, there are no signs that any splinter or dissident groups will emerge in the wake of the decision to dissolve. The final point, and I'm just closing up now, is that in terms of ETA members disengaging from armed struggle, now ETA has now announced its dissolution. This is not the first time that it's happened. ETA split in 1974. It became ETA military and ETA political military. And in 1982, around 300 members of ETA political military accepted an amnesty. And they were released from prison and allowed to come back from exile in response to renouncing the armed struggle. Many of those people integrated within a political party that already existed, that they had set up. Many people disengaged from politics entirely. But many of those people also found a hostile environment when they returned from prison to the Basque Country, as many people obviously had considered them as selling out on the cause. So it was a difficult decision for those people, and it's one that it doesn't exist now because the Basque nationalist left has come to an agreement that this is the way forward. And so that hostility that disengaging members had faced in 1982 is no longer there. So, just to round up, what has actually happened to ETA, and just to conclude in a couple of sentences, what has actually happened to ETA is its defeat. I wouldn't say that you could call it a defeat. It's certainly not a victory, as ETA has not achieved its political aims, but it's certainly a result of a long, drawn-out transformation and adaptation. And what was once the leadership of the Basque nationalist left, ETA, the vanguard of the Basque nationalist movement in its heyday in the 70s, has really become marginalised. And now we've seen the debate within the movement reaching a strategic decision that the armed struggle had to come to an end. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nick Hutcheon, for the fascinating presentation. Really a lot of food for thought there. And the ETA case specifically gives me or reminds us that you can have a macro level change. You can have, you know, the democratic transition, some reforms in the military, but still a continuation of armed tactics for a while. And then this is the case. We will see it in Chile as well. Mainly because the meso and micro level changes did not happen. You know, some of the stuff that we spoke about earlier on the leadership inducements and so on. But what's also fascinating about this case is the endorsement of, if we can say, the European elite for the transformation. You have involvement. You mentioned the Kofi Annan, Jerry Adams. We have also Ronnie Kasril, who's, I don't know where did he go now, but he was quite involved in that. He may have a few comments and questions for you. But also Martin Griffiths, the current UN envoy to Yemen, heavily involved in the whole negotiations process and weighing in heavily in the whole process, with significant results in the end, relatively speaking, in that sense. So I have to have a few thoughts as well, but I have to move on now to a bit east, the case of the PKK, Kurdistan's Workers' Party. And Murat Yeşiltaş is going to talk to us about how why is there a lack of transformation and why the PKK were not able to, despite attempts, was not able to make a change towards unarmed activism. So, floor is yours.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Omar. Thank you also for inviting me to this conference. It's a great honor to speak here. Such an important conference. So I think the PKK case is really important to understand the main driving factors behind the failure of peace process in Turkey. So in my presentation, I will first try to unpack the question of why PKK is not successful in transforming itself towards a non-terrorist organization or a political actor, or if you like. In other words, the puzzle I'm trying to understand is the nature of security policy nexus in the case of the PKK. So within this context, I will be trying to explain the question of what are the main driving factors behind the failure of the PKK's transformation from a terrorist organization to a political movement, by particularly focusing on last 10 years in Turkey. First of all, I argue that there has been incredible transformation of the PKK as a terrorist organization since its emergence in 1978 in terms of the evolution of the organizational structure, the strategy that the PKK has been using in its irregular war and the terrorist campaign, the conflict structure where the PKK has been operating, and the preference of strategic engagements that the PKK has been adopting with the other Kurdish political and armed groups in the region and the external actors as well. However, it can be secondly also argued that the PKK has never been aimed at real transformation, from my understanding, a strategy that aimed to become a normal political actors within the Turkish politics. This means that the PKK as a territorially oriented and ethnocentric nationalist, violent, non-state armed organization believes that politics is not enough. I think rather, another formulation, the PKK still has same strategic objective, namely establish a Kurdish state. This is the main strategic objective of the PKK. This is not a doubt about the policy of change or regime change in Turkey, but is a territorial change in which a new type of sovereignty, so to speak, hybrid one, should be exercised in a very specific territorial space. So the PKK was born a terrorist organization in Turkey, but it has been gradually became a regional organization, armed groups or non-state armed groups. So there is also lack of conceptual clarity in defining PKK's organizational structure, whether is it a terrorist organization, is it an insurgency group, or is it a non-state or violent non-state armed groups. So my presentation is divided into 4 sections. In the first section, I'll be focusing on the reasons behind the failure of peace process initiated by AK Party government in 2009 and formally started to exercise in 2013. So in the second section, I will try to unpack the transformation of the PKK strategy as well as the changing security dynamics of security landscape in Turkey by focusing on post-peace process and the post-Syrian uprising, which is the main factors, the failure of the PKK's transformation for me. So in the third section, I'm going to explore the dynamics behind the failure of the PKK's urban terrorist campaign or urban, insurgency within Turkey. And finally, I will briefly talk about the obstacle for the possible transformation of the PKK by taking into consideration the question of why it is so difficult to transform the PKK. So with regards to the first part of my presentation, the reason behind the failure of peace process. I think there are a number of reasons for the failure of peace process, not only emanating but the PKK's own strategy, but also the dynamic within the Turkish politics or within the Turkish governmental politics. But it is commonly believed that both the state and the PKK had made many mistakes in the management of the peace process. So number one, in terms of the reasons, the driving factors behind the failure of the peace process, number one is the ambiguity of the process itself. So when you look at the detail about the ambiguity, first of all, the problem of framing, the lack of comprehensive and clear-cut definition of the process itself. So there was no clear conceptual definition of the peace process. So the second one, I think, also important is the lack of methodological clarity. What is the methodology in the peace process? So the third one is the lack of institutional responsibility. For example, who or which institutions is the authority or has the authority to speak about the process itself or the paths of the process. So another one is the lack of comprehensive strategic communication strategy, especially within the government, within the AK Party government. So the last one is the lack of clarity with regards to main strategic objective of those who are integral part of the peace process. So what were the strategic objective of Turkish state actually? What were the strategic objective of AK Party government in that time, or what was the strategic objective of PKK in that time? So what was the end game for the parties? So within this context, the role of national reaction, I think, against the peace process was really important. Because as I mentioned before, the lack of clarity in framing the process was one of the important obstacles to shape the perception of the people, perception of the institutions in this process. For example, there were many names were given to this process: solution process, for example, national consensus, national unity and commonality project. So, for example, the opposition parties, contrary to the government or AK Party, call it as a dissolution process, by the way. It's the process aimed to divide Turkey into two different, states. So, therefore, there was no strong proponent of the peace process, especially when we look at the AK Party's political base and social base were so crucial to maintain the peace process, the discourse or the engagement within the peace process. So when you look at the perceptions of the other, society or identity groups in Turkey, secular nationalists, Islamist and conservatives, liberal, Kurds, pro-PKK Kurds and the pro-government Kurds have different, understanding with regards to the peace process. So it made the process very ambiguity in terms of the future of the peace process. Therefore, the opening was, the peace process was mainly misperceived as threat to Turkey's territorial integrity, which is the main component of the Republican, conservative, or if you like, nationalist security culture in Turkey. So the national unity was also perceived under attack. So when you look at the Republican security culture in Turkey, there are three different concept which can be a component of the security of Turkey. On the one hand, the territorial integrity of Turkey. The second one is national unity, and the third one is secularism in the eyes of especially the Republican security culture. So, when you look at the other side of the peace process, the PKK and the nationalist Kurdish movement contributed also to deepening the ambiguity. So in terms of the demanding from the government or the states, for example, the legal guarantees, it's mean constitutional guarantees, political guarantees, democratic and regional autonomy, which directly challenge the very nature of Turkey's state, Turkish state sovereignty, and the cultural rights, education in Kurdish language. In addition to this, the nationalist Kurdish movement also underlined that the PKK and its leader, Abdullah Öcalan, during the peace process should be also included in any possible peace negotiation. So, and some developments also contributed to deepening the ambiguity during the peace process, such as the mismanagement of the Habur incident. The symbolic return of the PKK militants to Turkey was very important in deepening this ambiguity in the peace process. So the incident became a celebration moment for the pro-PKK groups at the borders of Iraq, as well as radicalized the anti-peace process perception within the society. So another one, I think, in creating the ambiguity during the peace process was the PKK's appearance as an organization within multiple centers in the region. So number two is the uncertainty of the process. So there were domestic and regional uncertainty both for Turkey and the PKK. So the lack of constitutional framework, I think, was the main reason behind the uncertainty. The process itself was initiated by only government for many reasons. I think we can talk about later in Q&A session if we have time. So it was only a political attempt. So regionally, there were many opportunities for Turkey as well as for the PKK, such as northern Iraq and Syria. Another reason for the uncertainty was the lack of clarity of the end objective for the parties. So when you look at the state and military, because state and military or bureaucracy, I think, were representing the different understanding. They have a different conceptual framework with regards to the peace process. So for example, for the military, was it really a demilitarization of the PKK? So there was an uncertainty in terms of the way of demilitarization of the PKK. For the AK Party government, solving the Kurdish issue, was it really the end game? So for the PKK, Kurdish rights, autonomy, regional government or state. So there were also uncertainty. Number three, I think, as a driving factor behind the failure of the peace process, is the worst case scenario for both sides, for state or government and the PKK. So number four is I think in the last piece of the peace process in terms of the failure, action-reaction process. For example, the operation conducted by the police helped to shift the peace process towards a more radical way for different parties. So the PKK's game of autonomy was another factors behind the failure of peace process, especially in their aim to control the different region within the city centers. So general election accelerated the anxieties of different parties, especially the AK Party and the PKK representative party HDP. So in terms of the understanding the PKK's changing strategy in analyzing the failure of the transformation, this, I think, level is also important. And it transformed the conflict itself as well. First of all, the radicalization of the public and private space in the region by the PKK was one of the important phases of the changing strategy of the PKK, which caused the failure of the peace process as well. In the education institutions, religious institutions, PKK attempt to transform the very nature of the conventional Turkish, or Turkish system, state system. Another one is the sovereignty challenge against the very nature of the state authority in the region. PKK aimed to create some sort of new territorial order or new territorial control in different states. This, I think, was one of the important aspects behind the paradigmatic change of the AK Party government in order to, take a military action against the PKK. The another one, I think, the mobilization of the youths as an armed groups during the peace process. So the peace process during the 4 or 5 years provided PKK a big, opportunity to reconsolidate its power among the different, city center, among especially the southern part of Turkey, in terms of remobilization of the youths within the armed conflict. So I think the Syrian civil war and the PKK's increasing activity in the regional level were another reason to understand the changing dynamics of the PKK in the post-solution process. So as in the, third section, I mean, what are the main driving factors behind the PKK's urban strategy after the collapse of the peace process? This is also important to understand the potential transformation of the PKK in the Turkish politics, as well as to understand the changing dynamics of PKK strategy in the region. So there are many reasons behind the failure of PKK's insurgency in the city center against the Turkish security forces. The first one was the lack of combat experience of PKK and the military capacity, especially the youth or militant aged between 15 and 25, mostly recruit from the local populace. Those youth militias had no combat experience, nor they ever engaged in any military operation or armed conflict in Syria and Iraq, where the YPG and PKK conducted warfare against the Daesh. The second one is the lack of public support, which is really important in the insurgency movements or insurgency tactic of the armed group organization. When you look at the public support, I think there are many dynamics to get the public support, but these are very important. For example, effectiveness of the organization in order to maintain the insurgency against the state. The second one, motivation. Why we are fighting. So there was no clear-cut answer in the eyes of the public or in the eyes of the youth militia, youth member of the PKK, or what is our end game, what we are in this process. So perceived legitimacy is another factor in gaining public support, but there was also no, public perception to, support the legitimacy of use of violence of PKK against security forces as well as the civilian people. So acceptability of cost and risks, I think especially for those who want to back insurgency movement during the conflict, I think was another obstacle for PKK. Number 3 is the response of Turkish security forces. So this is all, I think, the crucial threshold to deter, to contain the insurgency in the southern part of Turkey. So, and the Syrian civil war, I think also important factor behind the failure of PKK's, insurgency. First of all, conflict spillover effect of the Syrian civil war influenced directly public perception. The people made an analogy between Turkey and Syria in terms of the, intensification of the conflict and limited manpower for the PKK in order to maintain its fight against Daesh, especially in Syria. So had to change the strategy in the region in terms of remobilization or remobilizing its manpower. And I think finally the lack of outside support was one of the important, driving factors behind the failure of PKK's surge against Turkey. So as a last section, how about the future transformation of the PKK? I think the question of possibility of transformation of the PKK from being a terrorist organization to unarmed political groups is a controversial for 2 main reasons. First of all, the first one is related to the organizational structure of the PKK in terms of operationalization of network power within Turkey. So when you look at the classical or conventional organizational structure of the PKK, there are three domains. The first one is the people front, the second one is the party front, and the armed group wing front. So these, I think, three domains are really important for PKK to transform itself as a military organization. For example, there is common to speak about that HDP is a political wing of PKK in Turkey. So is it really a necessity for PKK to transform itself to a political organization? So the second one is related to the geopolitical dynamics in the region. So of course, when we look at the details of the geopolitical dimensions, now is the public perception, I think, is shaped by the geopolitical developments in the region. So there is an incredible rupture in the perception of Turkish people, government and state towards another peace process in Turkey. The nature of organization is another obstacle in terms of how geopolitical developments in the region influence PKK's, organizational structure. So the PKK is now a regional violent terrorist organization which has multiple operational network of power. So security environment, PKK is operating in a very competitive security environment, especially in Syria and Iraq. So perceived space for strategic opportunity still, I think, alive for PKK. The opportunity for established a territorial order in Syria and Iraq. The opportunity for gaining a strategic autonomy, which means the freedom of action for the PKK, is still alive in Syria. So, of course, outside support, the US is particularly important actor in delivering military and political support to PKK in its fights against Daesh. So when you take into consideration these new dynamics in the region, it is really difficult to talk about a new peace process will be taking in place in Turkey, or government or the state is really thinking about another peace process in Turkey. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Fascinating insights as always, Dr. Yeşiltaş. So from there on, I'll open the floor for questions or comments or reactions. We don't have much time. We have about 10 minutes. So please, Mahari has an urgent one.
Yes. Thank you for all of you. I just wanted to take one point that looks common in the three presentations. In the case of ETA, for example, you mentioned, Nick, that...
we need...
Sorry for that. Thank you, Omar. And I was saying that there was one common, maybe in my understanding, and I want the presenters to clarify that if that is true. And that is about these efforts by different insurgent groups, either for secession or independence. In the case of ETA, for example, he said the marginalization of ETA partly came later on as Spain became more democratic and was able to concede some autonomy, cultural dispensation, and also a sort of, if not called officially, sort of federal of culture in the case of Basque. So the element of democratic dispensation or accommodation of diversity, cultural diversity or linguistic diversity comes at the point. It seems like also in the case of at least PKK, whether this was the case also to an extent, whether there was more democratization that allowed for this kind of less support for insurgency in the population, because it's an option where people can be engaged. And you mentioned, for example, during the period where there was negotiation, actually, while PKK tried to use it to mobilize people, but at the same time, that mobilization didn't lead to more strong hegemony, the word you were using, Gordon, the kind of narrative hegemony of narrative that is strong, extreme, that makes this kind of insurgency strong and maintain its force for a long time. Does that come in your papers, that some level of democratization in the form of cultural recognition and so on contributes to decline of these forces? This comes to my mind also in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, where you had different dynamics for a long time, and at some point it was completely different, and it was surprising for those of us who were following, for example, the Tamil Tigers. We thought they will not vanish at all. They will be there for a long time and so on. The second is, from Africa's perspective, we always wonder about Scotland, for example, referendum in Scotland. If you have referendum in Africa, you are 100% sure, almost 99%, that there will be independence. Any case you mentioned.
You're touching on a sensitive issue here
in
for
Scotland,
guys from the UK.
And that was different now. Is it partly, do you also associate it to this thesis that more democratic space will allow for less insurgents groups to have a footing on the ground? I just wanted to listen to your reactions on this.
Thank you very much. Abdullah had his hands first. I'll come back.
Thank you very much for the brilliant presentations from the three papers. Just wanted from Gordon, if you have 1 minute more. I was attracted by the de-radicalization. Most of the time it's confusing people, and sometimes some think tanks founding it, trying to simplify it. Just what I liked, if you can more, because there's big difference between the de-radicalization and the process of reconciliation, and so when you have time. Just 1 minute.
In the name of God, the most merciful, most compassionate, my question is to Mr. Murat regarding the PKK. Is the fact that now that the PKK has bases in Qandil and Sinjar inside Iraq, the reason for continuing the fighting, and is this what has led them to continue fighting and violate their agreement with Turkey? Number two, regarding the reasons for the failure of the agreement between the PKK and Turkey is not clear. I'm not convinced of the reasons you have just given. Maybe there is outside support. Don't forget, Turkey has many enemies. Maybe they are pushing them in this direction. And also the AK party is the most open to the question of Kurdish rights in southern Turkey. And if we compare their policies to those of the previous governments did not even recognize the word Kurdish people. They, at least relatively speaking, they have given some rights to the Kurdish people. So therefore, one of the reasons, in my opinion, why they're continuing violence is the outside support. Also, they benefited from the Kurdish presence in southeastern Syria, too.
Thank you for this presentations. To Dr. Jordan, you are referring about the role of the prisoner for the peace process in Ireland. And what about them after the agreement for the Great Friday? There is a general amnesty including in this agreement, or what? What happened for those prisoners? Thank you.
الأستاذة في الخلف.
My question is to Gordon about the long-term impact of Brexit on the process arrangement in Ireland, Northern Ireland, and if it really threatens the peace arrangements as some media reports recently referred.
One fine آخر سؤال تفضل أستاذ.
In fact, my question, I think, to Dr. Nick was talking about it, and it was interesting that the dissolution happened, and as you said, it took about 7 years from, about 7 years to reach this decision. So my question is, what do you think the main motivations, whether they are internally or externally, to reach such interesting decision? Thank you.
I think it was more than 7 years. Adolfo Suarez started in the late 70s, so it took a while to get there. Okay, now I'll give back the floor to the speakers. Gordon, you have a lot of questions, so I will let you, we'll switch the roles. So Murat, would you like to go first, and then Nick, and then Gordon? Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for the question. I received 2 questions, which both of them are very important, I think, very great question. The first one, regarding the dilemma between democratization and the de-radicalization of the PKK or any other terrorist organization. I think this is a very, important dilemma which the international scholars are trying to solve, but in the case of PKK is totally different. I tell you why. I mean, for example, the question of why ordinary people takes extraordinary risk by joining an armed group to fight against state forces. Why is the main reason for this? I mean, when we look at the PKK, there is an interesting, statistic about the recruitment of the PKK during the peace process. So when you look at the peace process, the number of the people who want to join the PKK increase because there is no risk for them, but during the conflict era the number is decreasing. So this is very important. And the second one is the more flexibility in the security domain provide more strategic maneuver for the PKK to consolidate its power within the society, especially. For example, during the peace process, PKK decided to establish a new foundation to reorganize its networks of power within the society. For example, the Association of Communities for Kurdistan. This organization has responsible for all, regulation on behalf of PKK in the region. So they have, the schools, they have, companies. They have many things to regulate the everyday life. So therefore, there is a dilemma for the democratization and the de-radicalization of the PKK. Regarding the second question, I think outside support is very important. In the beginning of the peace process, one of the important driving factors for the AK Party to take a responsibility to deal with this kind of conflict was the support of the European Union. In order to become a European Union, member during the 2005, 2006, and 2007, so the European Union supported this initiative, this peace process. So therefore, the outside support was important in this regard. But after following the Syrian civil war, the outside support, I think, dramatically changed in terms of consolidating the PKK's or YPG's power in Syria, and this directly influenced the PKK's strategic thinking about its presence within Turkey, and this was the main reason also the failure of the peace process. Of course, AK Party has an important actor in terms of dealing with the Kurdish issue from the perspective of multiculturalism, the common religious idea, and so on and so forth. And it's not comparable with the previous government, but the conditions, the new geopolitical realities in the region now also, I think, radically reshaped the AK Party's perception towards the PKK. But at this stage, I think AK Party or President Erdogan is trying to separate Kurdish issue from the PKK issue. There are, I think, strong narrative with regards to the Kurdish issue and the PKK issue. So therefore, I think we are going to see a different direction in Turkey in terms of the transformation of the Kurdish issue as well.
Thank you. Nick, please.
Well, first of all, in relation to the Basque Country and ETA, the connection with autonomy, I mean, ETA's most active years were 1978 to 1980, and it was actually, after the death of Franco in 1975. At that time, ETA was trying to push for negotiations with the Spanish state to achieve some of its aims. That then led to 1980, when, and not as a result of ETA's activities, but in 1980 there was the establishment in the Spanish state of the autonomous communities. And at that point, these two communities here, the Basque Autonomous Community and the Autonomous Community of Navarre, were established. So, although it was short of independence, it was certainly something that a lot of the Basque population would have seen at the very least as a step forward. But also with ETA, yes, its objectives were Basque independence, the creation of a Basque state, and a socialist Basque state, but also it was very closely linked to Basque identity and language. And when ETA was formed in the late 1950s, it was a young group of students, and those people were particularly concerned with issues relating to identity and language. Those people and those who came after kind of redefined who they considered to be a Basque. The oldest Basque nationalist party is the PNV, which was established in the late 1890s. And their idea of who was Basque was based on descent. If you were born in the Basque Country, if your ancestors were Basque, you were Basque. ETA came and then focused on language. And at that time, when ETA came into existence, the Basque language was banned. When the autonomous communities were established in 1980, then the Basque language was also allowed to be spoken and taught in schools. Something that's very noticeable now in the Basque Country is that certainly most young people, certainly under the age of maybe 25, speak Basque. Many people in the Basque Country are often quite pessimistic about the language and the future of it, but young people speak it because they're mostly taught at school. But not only that, there was legislation brought in to make it essential to work in public administration. So the identity issue was far less precarious than it was when ETA came into existence, when part of what they believed they were fighting for was to protect actually the Basque identity. Also, the fact that in a democracy, there was the possibility of a kind of open political culture, and around ETA, and not necessarily around ETA, but there is a very kind of open and omnipresent political culture in the Basque Country. I mean, every town, every village has signs of it everywhere you go. And that's particularly the case with the Basque nationalist left, which ETA is associated with. So there is also a very open political culture in the Basque Country. So it's not suppressed in the way it was under Franco. The Basque language can be spoken. So these things are far more open. There is a form of independence, you could call it. The Basque Country has a lot of independence. So many of the issues that ETA were formed to fight for are kind of there enough to convince a large proportion of the population that armed struggle was not the way to further the cause towards maybe more autonomy and more rights for the language. In terms of Scotland, I think what's interesting there is that Scotland's identity has always actually been far less at risk, or perceived to be at risk. So since the Union was created in 1707, many Scottish institutions have remained in place, particularly the church, law and education. So actually in many ways in people's day-to-day lives, the Scottish independence to some extent is already there. So, and the way that, particularly under the dictatorship in Spain, there was an attempt to kind of force a Spanish identity on all the population. That hasn't happened to the same extent in the UK. And most Scots would say that they feel quite at ease with their identity, or even dual identity within the UK, and don't feel it's at risk. So essentially in Scotland, it may seem bizarre that a majority would vote against self-government, but the argument essentially came down. Most of it are down to kind of very practical arguments about finance, currency, EU membership. Bizarrely now, that didn't work out very well. But it's mostly been about these things rather than the sentimental side related to identity, where people feel quite comfortable within the UK being Scottish as well. The other question, which was about why ETA had come to this decision now, as Omar has also hinted there, I mean, it has been the result of a long process. And I would say that the process, it does link with the establishment of the autonomous communities in 1980. The Spanish government has engaged with ETA on a number of occasions throughout the last 38 years. There have been negotiations, and that was ETA's objective, was to force the Spanish state into negotiating in some kind of meaningful way that would produce results for them. That hasn't happened, but negotiations have happened at various stages. And also in terms of kind of producing a Basque nationalist alliance was another objective, and it hasn't worked. And the big obstacle to that is that the PNV, which is the Basque Nationalist Party, the party of government in the Basque Autonomous Community, I should point out the Basque Nationalist Party has been the party of government in the Basque Country for 34 of 38 years. So it's the main force in the Basque Autonomous Community, but it's one of two strands of Basque nationalism, and they will not enter any alliance with the left of the nationalist movement as long as violence is a presence. So for both reasons, and also because of what we mentioned there, declining popular support, and also a loss, I would say, of the leadership of the movement as well. That's been overtaken by the political side, and I think it's something that has been a long time coming. And I think finally we got to a point in the last few years when a decision was reached from within the movement, and the pressure came from within the movement to actually end the armed struggle and dissolve ETA, is what they announced this year.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Nick, for that. Last but not least, Gordon, who has quite a few questions to deal with, and thank you, Mahari, for throwing this wrench out of. We barely made it as a United Kingdom, and you want to bring it down now. Please.
De-radicalisation is unpopular for a reason, because the term is just so problematic. I think that, and it's defining the term has been pretty confusing, and that's had an impact on policy. I think that Omar Ashour's definition of de-radicalisation is one of the best, most nuanced ones. Unfortunately, you don't really see that, correct me if I'm wrong, in de-radicalisation programmes. So the way de-radicalisation has been understood is primarily in terms of ideology, and an assumption of that ideology causes behaviour. It also, as you correctly pointed out, it conflates a lot of things like reconciliation. Now, these are DDR programmes, so by labelling them as de-radicalisation is a misnomer. So these are some of the problems. Specifically in terms of ideology, why is that problematic? Because ideology does not correlate with behaviour, and disengagement is not caused by de-radicalisation. And many times it's the opposite way around. I've spoken about in Northern Ireland. I think it's a unique case where it's the opposite way around. I think there was radicalisation which caused disengagement. But once again, that's just unique to that specific case. Interestingly, I'm doing a current study that while de-radicalisation is problematic academically, if you look at the public, so I'm doing a study on public responses to de-radicalisation. They support the term, they support policies more when the term de-radicalisation is used, precisely because it's ambiguous. It can be exploited by the left wing and right wing, to the point that you get the Daily Mail I don't know if you heard of it, a terrible newspaper in the UK, almost to the far right. And it is, while you think it would oppose de-radicalisation, it's actually more nuanced, it's supportive of it, because of that ambiguity. And this is why governments will keep reproducing this term. The other two questions, I think I combine them together. So prisoners were released on remand. So to an extent like an amnesty, but if they breached their parole conditions, they would get put back in Islam or back in prison. Prisoners were released, they didn't have rights, they didn't, in a sense, opportunities for jobs. So that made it problematic for prisoners to reintegrate back in society. So what you saw was the development of prisoner programs by former combatants setting up prisoner networks. And who funded that? The European Union. The European Union funded the networks that helped reintegrate former combatants, helped prisoners, but it also helped many of the interface networks which prevented violence within communities. So in Brexit, we talk understandably about the border. We've not talked about who's going to refund the peace projects, the £3 billion at least that the European Union has put into Northern Ireland. Who's going to fund that? Is the UK government going to fund that? There's a reason why the UK government wasn't going to fund that, because the IRA would never ever accepted it. They don't want money from the British government. They happily have money from the European Union. So we've got a problem there, especially when that funding was uniquely, and here I'll link it back to de-radicalisation, that funding in Northern Ireland was no conditions. They didn't care about your ideology. To an extent, they even turned a blind eye to a little bit of violence here and there, because they gave the funding because they knew in the long term it would incentivise moving away from violence. Look at UK funding networks. It's about ideology, it's about conditions, about Britishness. So you can't, if it's going to turn to a British approach, I don't know how they're going to deal with that. So just wait and see. I guess that's the answer to the Brexit question. Wait and see and pray and hope.
Thank you very much. I have to put this to an end now. I have to thank as well again the panelists and the audience for this very interesting, fascinating session. Gordon gave us more food for thought, and that will be continued in the Latin America session. So at the moment, we will take 15 minutes break, 10 to 15 minutes break, and then come back here to continue with the cases of Latin America and the Caribbean. Thank you very much.